Good morning. It is Wednesday, January 6, 2015. This is your morning edition on I-24 News. Coming up later today, a year after the heinous massacres in the Charlie Hebdo offices in Paris, the satirical magazine is putting out a new edition, targeting God. U.S. President Barack Obama makes an emotional case for tougher gun restrictions. And intelligent true crime is TV's new greatest hit, and its shockwave effect is already being felt in the judicial system in the United States. We're going to take a closer look. Good morning. We begin, however, today with breaking news from North Korea, where authorities say they have successfully tested a hydrogen bomb amid reports of a tremor near the main nuclear site. State media announced the test after monitors detected a 5.1 magnitude earthquake close to the Pyeonggi site. The North is thought to have conducted 3 previous underground nuclear tests there since 2006. Now, if this is true, the development would significantly escalate the nuclear challenge from the world's most isolated regime. Neighboring states, countries in the region have issued strong condemnation already and announced emergency meetings. Japan said it sees the test as a threat to its national security and vowed a firm response. North Korea, however, has already issued a statement saying that they will not use the nuclear bomb if their country is not invaded. But of course, we will be following the story on I-24 News throughout the day, and we'll be updating you on every half hour on the hour. Now, going back to our issue of the day, it is also a year today in Paris, where as we speak, with a year in Paris that the Charlie Hebdo attacks took place. And as we speak, new issues of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo are landing on newsstands. The special edition marks a year since the terror spree that began with the storming of the magazine's Paris offices and ended up with 17 people killed. The January 7th attack proved to be the forebearer of the suicide bombings and shootings in the city 10 months later, in which 130 people died in a music club, restaurants, and a soccer stadium. Needless to say, it was a very tough year for the city of Paris. Now, throughout the week, France will commemorate the victims of the attacks on the Satirical Weekly and a Jewish supermarket with eulogies, ceremonies, and memorial plaques. True to its form, Charlie Hebdo pulled no punches this week in its magazine cover, which depicts a cartoon illustration of God with blood on his hands and a rifle strapped to his back. The caption reads, "1 year later, the assassin is still on the run." But is the rest of the country as defiant? So to figure that out, with me in studio this morning is former Israeli ambassador to France, Daniel Sheck. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And before we break it down, let's take a look at the following report. Pick it up from there.
A somber mood in Paris, where the names of the victims of last January's jihadist attack on Charlie Hebdo are read out in front of the French Satirical's headquarters. As if winking one last time from the grave, Wolinski's name has been misspelled. There are no big speeches, just a few words from those who survived, directed at the families of the victims.
To me, this monument is something done by the political leaders to say, we will not forget. It forces us. It forces us to act more, and I think that's what it symbolizes.
We realize that it's important to remember the names of the victims in everyday life, not to remember exclusively the names of the murderers.
Journalists massacred, police officers executed, Jews held hostage and then murdered in Paris, in the 11th arrondissement and in Porte de Vincennes. One of the managers of the kosher supermarket still has a hard time accepting what happened.
Indeed, it happened to us, but at the same time, it is a collective tragedy. That's our message. We need to move on and not to give up. We need to show that they didn't crush us.
I live right here, upstairs, and I can't go back. I'm too scared.
Paradoxically, the most optimistic person attending the ceremony is one of the heroes of the supermarket attack.
I'm smiling because, yes, it was a dramatic event, but after that, you have to go back to your normal life. It's not like we are going to forget what happened here, but we are going to try to move on.
As soon as the commemoration has ended, and as if to show that life goes on, the kosher store reopens its doors.
That was Olivier Lerner's report from Paris. And joining us now over the phone from Lyon, France, is David Hornus, the director of Court Guard, an independent intelligence security company in France. Mr. Hornus, I want to thank you for joining us. And to begin with, a year after the attacks, is France a safer place? Because I think it shocked not just the country, not just France, but the world entire, when just 10 months later there was this another heinous attack, another terror attack in Paris. Is France safer? Security measures put in place. What is your opinion about that?
Well, good morning, and thank you for asking this very interesting question. Yes, according to me and according to a lot of intelligence and security analysts, France is not a safer place than last year. We have to take into consideration the numerous attempts or terrorist attacks which are done every week, almost every single day, everywhere in France. So, of course, all of those try of attempts do not have as numerous victims as the two dramatic events we face in January and in November. But for instance, the 2nd of January in Valence, south of France, an individual tries to strike with his car 4 military who were doing a static boarding in front of a mosque. And a few days later, another guy in the same area of south of France, in a small town named Port-les-Valence, has been arrested by police. He was radicalized, and police found in his home guns with numerous weapons and picture of Salah Abdeslam. So people must be very aware that in France, since the statements of the Islamic State in September 14, a lot of individuals are trying to strike French interests everywhere and every day in any manners. So that's something you must be very aware.
Now, just quickly, one question, Mr. Hornus. When we're looking at ISIS from the rise from 2014, as you mentioned, indeed, it is hard to combat that type of terror, and terror in general is hard to combat. But what do you think France should do in order to try and prevent possible, and let's hope there won't be, future attacks?
Well, it's also a very difficult question. What can France do? The president put a state of emergency, which is already a pretty high level of non-democratic way of implementing security. But every single Muslim can become tomorrow a lone wolf and can strike French interests and kill people just because they would have listened to this ISIS statement. So we are facing a very challenging situation in France, and it is going to be very, very difficult not to have another huge strike in this country. Let's hope
that is not the case, but I want to thank you for joining us this morning from Lyon in France. Ambassador Shek, former Israeli ambassador to France, when we're looking at Paris, when we're looking at France a year on, as I ask, what can be done? That's the other thing. And is there, has the situation been internalized when it comes to possible future threats, or are we looking, because we were listening to Mr. Hornus, it feels like every Frenchman feels that every Muslim is a threat. I'm magnifying this right now, but what can be done other than that?
Look, I think that Charlie Hebdo was a sobering moment for French society, because everybody knew that the difficult relationship between the French majority and the Muslim minority is something that is brewing and something that one day can sort of blow up in their faces, and suddenly it did. So I do think it had an effect, but the effect is the one that you would want to be in a large, vibrant city and large, vibrant, democratic society like Paris and France, and that is of recovery. You don't want a city like Paris to permanently live in a state of siege. We know this from here in Tel Aviv. I mean,
recently, yes.
The big power of such the solidity of such societies is their ability to recover as quickly as possible and to return to normal life. Now, normal life doesn't mean that you turn your back on the threat. And if you look at Paris today, if you walk through the streets in any French city, you will see a massive presence of security forces, much more than here in Israel. Soldiers, police, gendarmerie, all that. And that is part. your guest on the phone spoke about the state of emergency, which is a very controversial issue in France, in the media and in the political scene. It's counterintuitive to their way of life, but it is something that they feel they need to do. Is this going to guarantee that it will avoid another attack? We both know that nobody can make such a promise.
Now, but when we're looking at Charlie Hebdo specifically, and I want us to bring up the cover of the magazine a year later, which is a very, one has to state an opinion about this cover. It is a very controversial cover.
It is.
It's
the whole idea of Charlie Hebdo.
It's the whole idea of Charlie Hebdo. It's the whole idea of free press, égalité, liberté. But the argument that came up last year in many news media, that you saw also from mainstream news media in the West, saying, "Don't do this.
Yes.
Don't go all the way that
it's far. Irresponsible.
It's irresponsible."
Yes. I know very well. I can understand the debate, but on the one hand, you can't be a magazine like Charlie Hebdo and not go all the way. And since last time it was the controversy was about the Muslim, was about the prophet. Here it takes the generic God, the generic religion as the motivator of so much bloodshed and so much suffering all around the world, not just in France.
Right.
I think it's a very strong statement. It's a very delicate one, and nobody can say that it points a finger at a specific...
To the Muslim God, to the Jewish God.
It's the generic God. It's the way anyone will imagine a God that, so to speak, has the general responsibility about the well-being in this world. You have to agree, you have to admit that he didn't do a great job last year. So there is something here.
There is something. And listen, I think Charlie Hebdo, at the end of the day, satire wants you to state an opinion or form an opinion, and we cannot ignore the fact that religious wars...
I'm speaking satirically too, but but undoubtedly this will awaken more debates and more argument, which is exactly the point of a magazine.
People would argue
like,
that's the point of press in many ways.
Yes.
But I don't think we can do this without going live to Jerusalem now, where we're joined by French-Israeli cartoonist Michel Kishka. And Michel, good morning to you, and I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning. A fabulous cartoon artist yourself.
Good morning.
Good morning. You yourself knew actually several people who were murdered, who were killed last year at Charlie Hebdo, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I knew 4 of the 5 artists who were assassinated last year.
And they were your friends, and then after that heinous attack, when basically cartoonists were put, so to speak, on the run. I'm looking at your work. Are you afraid yourself? No, I think nobody is afraid, really. I think that the aim of the terrorists is to make us afraid and trembling when we are working. I mean in the democratic countries. And I think that the healthiest reaction is to go on doing our work. And I think the last cover that you were talking about with Daniel Sheikh is a wonderful piece of art as a satirical cartoon, because it's tackling the terrorist's God. Because, if you watch the cartoon, he has blood on his robe and he holds a Kalashnikov. So this is not really God. This is God in the eyes of terrorists. This is the God that terrorists are worshipping, a murderer. This is why the title is "The Murderer is Still Running." And I think it's a very, very good and strong statement 1 year after what happened. 1 year after what happened. And you also brought out new cartoons in response to the anniversary, so to speak, of the Charlie Hebdo murders. What did you paint?
Oh, I was asked to draw a cartoon because we have this Thursday in the French Institute in Tel Aviv a panel discussion with French and Israeli cartoonists, colleagues of mine, and we were all asked to do something. And I did a sort of a cartoon about not being afraid, which was one of the main slogans. Last year we had 2 slogans. One was "Je suis Charlie," and the second one was "We are even not afraid," which was, a sort of shout of the French people and a shout of solidarity with what was happening.
In terms of solidarity with what was happening, I'm going to ask you the same question, or the debate that came up last year. specifically also around the Charlie Hebdo form, pardon me, modus operandi of satirical cartoons. Do you think it's irresponsible? Because at the end of the day, there are some people who are offended, as we know, very offended by religious cartoons. Should we be, in this day and age, where there's so much terror, where people take that as an excuse to go and murder people, continue that form of press?
This is both a right and a wrong question, because that question he raised last year after the murdering, because some of the people in France said, "Je ne suis pas Charlie, I'm not Charlie," which means that some of them thought that they went too far in their cartoons. But we don't have to forget two things. First, this is a satirical, free, independent magazine, and they have the total freedom of speech, expression, and drawing, and they are protected by laws in France who are defining the limits of this freedom, okay? And they were working in the framework of those laws. But the second thing is that the people who thought 1 year ago that they probably have gone too far, on the 13th of November, they understood they were mistaken, because the 130 people who were murdered in Paris, in the Bataclan and the others, they were not cartoonists. And I think that the people who thought that Charlie Hebdo went too far understood a few months later, sadly, that what is attacked is the French way of life, is the French democracy, is the French secular society, the model that they try to live in, and not the cartoon. The cartoon was just a pretext and an excuse for them.
Just a pretext and an excuse for them, and I think it's important words and an analysis to hear. Michel Kishka, I want to thank you for joining us from Jerusalem this morning. Ambassador Czech, to conclude, looking at Europe as a whole after, because it wasn't just Charlie Hebdo, and it was also, the attacks 10 months later, and it's all the terror threats that are coming around. Where do you see that continent heading in wake of what, sadly, and I hope I'm wrong, probably would be more threats and more attacks?
Well, as I said, Charlie Hebdo was sobering. It was the beginning of a general feeling of disarray, I think, all across Europe, but certainly in France, because France was physically targeted. And my friend Michel made a very strong point that terror in the end, even if the first wave was sort of targeted, a Jewish supermarket, a satirical
magazine.
After that, terror became what it always is, which is a random killing tool. Because the idea is to terrorize. It's not to kill. The idea is to terrorize. And in a sense, what happened in Belgium a week after what happened in France was a bigger success for terrorism. They shut down the country for a few days.
Or as they did in Munich a week ago.
I'm afraid this is something that Europe, like other parts of the world, will have to start getting used to. It's a presence. You have to fight back. You have to do as much as you can to prevent it. But you have to take into account that modern life, unfortunately, includes also fighting terrorism.
Fighting terrorism. Ambassador Czech, I want to thank you for joining me this morning as we move along.